I was raised to solve problems, not create them. So I may have lost a vote today, but as I walk out of this chamber, I feel fortunate to have served the American people. I leave the speakership with a sense of pride, accomplishment, and yes, optimism.
So yesterday, something unprecedented happened in American politics. For the first time in our nation's history, the Speaker of the House was actually forced out through a vote of the entire House of Representatives, initiated by a member of his own party, Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida, along with 7 other Republicans, voting in line with all the Democrats to oust Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, which really throws the entire GOP caucus into chaos, because while there is an interim Speaker in Representative Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, it's very likely, if not almost certain, he's not going to remain in that role very long, while the Republicans sort of sort out who's going to be the next Speaker of the House and really who's going to be their mouthpiece in Washington for the next year and a half or so. So we're going to talk about what this means for the Republican Party going forward, why the Republican caucus has been so chaotic over the past year, and ultimately what lies ahead for Republicans as they go into 2024, extremely divided and very ineffective in Washington. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So some could argue that Kevin McCarthy was sort of the compromise candidate between the, further right MAGA Freedom Caucus wing of the Republican Party and more of the establishment generic conservative wing of the Republican Party, as he was somebody who made both sides happy. Again, you had that almost embarrassing speaker vote when the Republicans took power. I think it took nearly 15 times in order for the Republicans to finally choose Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. And he gave the members of the Freedom Caucus many concessions, although one of the reasons why Matt Gaetz ended up voting out Kevin McCarthy in part was because he believed that McCarthy wasn't being honest with the Freedom Caucus and wasn't keeping up with his end of the bargain. But really, if you look at Kevin McCarthy's position, he's in a very unenviable position as the Speaker of the House, now former Speaker of the House, with where the Republican Party was after the 2022 midterms. If you recall, Republicans were supposed to win pretty big in 2022. All the polls indicated, all the historical trends pointed to a massive win for Republicans. And yet, at the end of the day, the promised red wave never materialized at all, and Republicans only won 222 seats, whereas they really should have won around 240, something like that, more along the lines of what we saw back in 2010 or 2014 or even 2016 with the members of the House. But ultimately, Republicans barely held on to the majority, and really ever since then, you've seen a very rocky relationship between the Matt Gaetzes, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Lauren Boeberts of the party, and really the rest of the party, the more moderate members of the party, Mike Lawler, Anthony Esposito, these more moderate, both of them happen to be from New York, but the more moderate members of the Republican Party who, are obviously in Biden districts. They're trying to win re-election in 2024, and they're trying to get some accomplishments under their belts so that they have something to run on in 2024, because it's going to be a very difficult year for Republicans going into 2024, especially given the fact that as of right now, it looks like Republicans might be poised to lose the House of Representatives alone based on some of the redistricting cases we've had in relation to, deep southern districts, the VRA, Alabama's map being struck down by the Supreme Court siding with the liberals on that, and potentially a number of other states in the deep south being affected. So, Democrats are poised to gain several seats as a result, potentially, from those cases. So right off the bat, Republicans could already be at a disadvantage going into 2024. But all this chaos revolving around the speakership, Donald Trump, the divisive primaries, it's really setting Republicans up for disaster. Kind of like the warning signs we saw back in 2022 when you had an extremely divided party that really should have won the election, should have done well in that midterm cycle, and ultimately fell short. We're sort of seeing the same thing again going into 2024. So back to Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy is gone as Speaker. Again, this has never happened before. This is the first time in our nation's history that a Speaker has actually been forced out via a vote. If we take a look at the breakdown, 208 Democrats and 8 Republicans, totaling 216 representatives, voted to oust McCarthy, and 210 and 0 Democrats voted to actually retain McCarthy as Speaker. So again, this is unprecedented. Andy Biggs, Ken Buck, Tim Burchett, Eli Crane, Matt Gaetz, Bob Good, Nancy Mace, which is a very interesting one, and Matt Rosendale all voted to oust Kevin McCarthy. They're all Republicans. Of course, all the Democrats voted to oust McCarthy as well. And then the rest of the Republican caucus, basically 95% of the Republican caucus, voted to keep McCarthy. So there really was unity in the Republican Party behind McCarthy for the most part. You just had really these 8 rogue members of the House vote against him, which of course, if we take a look back at the election results from 2022, that's more than enough to get McCarthy out of office. Again, now some of the representatives were absent for this, but you basically had all the Democrats vote out McCarthy and 8 of the Republicans. Now, there were some Democrats that had signaled that they would be open to talking to Kevin McCarthy. Some of the more moderate Democrats, Jared Golden, that representative from Joe Kent's district, the Democrat, I forget her name. But you had a number of Democrats who sort of hinted that they would have potentially been open to bailing out McCarthy had he reached out to negotiate with them. But McCarthy had said before that he wasn't going to make any concessions to the Democrats. And of course, as a result, none of the Democrats decided to support him. You had Hakeem Jeffries, who now leads the Democratic caucus in the House, basically tell all of his members not to vote to retain McCarthy, to oust him as Speaker. And of course, that's exactly what they did, since McCarthy really didn't give the Democrats any reason to keep him as Speaker. And now the Democrats have the opportunity and really the upper hand to actually use their leverage here, because the Republican caucus is so divided, especially if you have Matt Gaetz, the other members of the Freedom Caucus sort of hold out against some of the other choices that may be proposed, potentially Jim Jordan, who I think they would probably support somebody like Jim Jordan, but you may have more moderate members of the caucus like the Brian Fitzpatricks or the Mike Lawlers maybe be against that. But you have Jim Jordan being thrown around. Steve Scalise is being thrown around as a replacement. Steve Scalise was thrown around the first time when we have the speakership votes, although he really wasn't interested in becoming speaker. But every time there's sort of a speakership vote, his name gets thrown around again, so he might be in the running. But we're really not sure. Some people have speculated that some Democrats, some of the more moderate to centrist Dems, may side with the majority of Republicans and potentially backing a more moderate Republican, maybe somebody like Don Bacon as Speaker. But again, if you're a conservative Republican, ousting McCarthy, in my view, is a very, very foolish venture, because you really don't have any replacement lined up, especially since some of the McCarthy allies may be very bitter that McCarthy was ousted like this, especially since you had the Republicans basically teaming up, these Freedom Caucus Republicans teaming up with Democrats to oust their guy. So obviously they're not going to be too happy when one of their own decides to run for Speaker. They're probably going to vote against them, and we're going to have this prolonged chaos. But, you know, a lot of this really started to heat up when we had the continuing resolution that was basically designed to prevent the government from shutting down. McCarthy got some Democratic votes to bail him out there when you had Gaetz and other Freedom Caucus holdouts sort of stopping that. And of course, stopping the shutdown was an objectively good thing for Republicans, because it certainly would have had a negative impact on them in the court of public opinion and potentially in the Virginia legislative races, which of course are tied very close to Washington, since you have a lot of those competitive districts in Northern Virginia, which are tied to federal jobs in DC. So Republicans were smart to avoid that with the continuing resolution. But now we're in the position where Republicans have no replacement to Kevin McCarthy. The Freedom Caucus has helped to oust, and when I say Freedom Caucus, I don't even mean the majority of the Freedom Caucus, because currently there's 46 members, I believe, of the Freedom Caucus. You really only had a handful of them actually vote out Kevin McCarthy. Nancy Mace, I don't believe, is even in the Freedom Caucus. Yet for some odd reason, you know, Nancy Mace is sort of the weird, almost pro-choice Republican. She has views really all over the place. She's more liberal on some of the social issues like abortion, gay rights, things like that. She's, sort of more in the center. But on issues like immigration, she's a bit of a hardliner. So Nancy Mace is a really odd character in the Republican Party and maybe warrants her own video. But she voted to oust McCarthy really out of nowhere, which came as a surprise to, I think, a lot of people, considering, most people expected the ultra-conservative Republicans maybe to oust him. But somebody like Nancy Mace really doesn't fit that bill. So it's really odd, I think, to have somebody like her decide to remove McCarthy. But again, you put Republicans in an extremely difficult position now that McCarthy's gone. They're going to have to pick a new speaker. Like I said, McCarthy allies are not going to be happy with the Gaetz types. In fact, you already have Republicans calling to expel Matt Gaetz from the Republican caucus. Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House in the Clinton era after, of course, the 1994 Republican wave, said the House GOP should expel anti-Republican Gates, basically saying that Gates has sided with Democrats to knock off McCarthy over very childish and very trivial differences, and basically giving Democrats the upper hand here. And he does have a point in the sense that this drama is now at the forefront of the national discourse. Of course, the Freedom Caucus thinks they're going to get a better speaker out of this. I think it's sort of unlikely, especially since you may have McCarthy allies side with some of the Democrats to elect somebody a bit more moderate, sort of out of spite, given what's happened. So there really wasn't a smart way to go about this from the Freedom Caucus's perspective, unless they had somebody already lined up that had broad Republican support. That isn't the case. So, of course, in the coming days, we're going to see what's going to happen in regards to the House GOP and who they're going to pick as the next speaker. But we may be in a situation where some concessions are going to have to be made to some of the more moderate members of the Democratic Party. Again, Jared Golden, Mary Peltola, these types, in order to vote for a more moderate speaker, maybe somebody like Don Bacon or something like that. But again, Democrats so far have been unwilling to bail out somebody like McCarthy, so it's very possible that they will make this process very difficult for Republicans. And this, I think, was a very foolish move on the part of Matt Gaetz and his co-conspirators, because now you really don't have somebody who's going to be as willing to listen to your demands. McCarthy had constantly given the Freedom Caucus what they wanted. He made many concessions to them. Now the Speaker of the House, the next Speaker of the House, may be a lot more hostile to them. So I think even from their point of view, this is a foolish move. Matt Gaetz certainly hasn't made many friends with this effort. And in fact, behind the scenes, the vast majority of the House Republicans despise the guy. So it really is sort of a lose-lose situation for Gaetz, just for 5 minutes of fame and sort of being in the limelight here. So anyway, of course, comment your thoughts down below. I'm curious what you guys think about this. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.